Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray. Back in the saddle again.
Yes.
We had a little break to rejuvenate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling a little more rejuvenated. And we let some fucking rednecks take over the show for a minute.
Yeah.
Thanks to the Dales.
Yes.
And we're ready to go.
That was great. I gotta say, that was one of our more bizarre.
Well, definitely
episodes.
The most bizarre.
I mean, I don't know if it's more bizarre in that we did like a total sketch show, which we've never done. I mean, objectively, some of the 09A stuff we've done in the past is more bizarre.
That's true.
This is
well, the source material here is pretty strong.
Yeah,
I gotta
exactly.
say. I mean, you can't go wrong with the Dark Lords.
Yeah, it's not entirely
Satanic
fictional,
front.
actually.
That was what I thought was the most disturbing about it. Was that at certain points I just thought, oh, this is just a radio show from the satanic hell world to come in Azle, Texas.
Yeah,
Yep.
so if you're not a premium subscriber and you want to hear some very bizarre...
Yeah, and probably
Satanic.
offensive to my fellow Southerners. But you know what, man? When you get dragged to enough fucking Tuna, Texas specials growing up,
just flows naturally.
revenge will come.
I only understood some of those words, so yeah.
Yeah, oh, god damn.
But yeah, I would also like to give a shout out to the listeners for being cool since we had that little break. People seemed very concerned and supportive, which is very nice.
Yes.
We had kind of varying levels of crisis here at the compound from pretty minute to pretty extreme. So we're back.
Yes.
It's nice to know that some of the folks that listen to this insanity are pretty cool, and we appreciate that.
Almost all of them are cool. And
we have really cool listeners.
It's not such a big listenership, but pretty
Except for the ones
cool.
that listen on YouTube, that seems to be almost exclusively
Of course.
Nazis.
Well, that's a different. That's our other base. That's the base.
We haven't moved on to BitChute yet, so I guess
That's right. We haven't crossed that line yet.
Fuck me.
And we're not only back, but we're back. We're actually starting a new arc.
That's right.
Finally.
Yeah.
That little inter-arc period lasted a little longer than I thought it was going to, but what can you do? It is what it is. I think longtime listeners of the show will know that this fourth arc we were originally intending on doing in the second arc, that is covering ex-Yugoslav emigre, Nazi, fascist, nationalist organization, terrorist groups. But we decided we were going to go, back in time and give a little bit more context, which, turned into about 20 odd episodes.
Yeah, like the inter-arc. Yes.
Yes. The origin of national ideas, Chetnik, Solstice, World War II.
Yep.
All that stuff. And
Balkan shit.
I think that was ultimately good because a lot of those characters that we talked about are going to make an appearance in this arc, and it'll definitely be good to have for reference for those of you that haven't listened to Arc 2. Arc 4 isn't going to make as much sense without it, so that's recommended listening. But for this arc, I think we're also going to take it pretty far back, and I guess the approach we're going to take is slightly different, right? I mean... To me, I saw this for a couple of reasons, and maybe I'll go into some of that now. I'll begin rant.
Yeah. Maybe just to say it, so the central theme of this fourth arc that we're starting today are the Serbian and Croatian nationalist and fascist terrorists in the post-Second World War period.
The Cold War, basically.
Yeah, in the Cold War period. But we'll start as we do a little bit before that to set the stage for that, because what we're talking about Serbian and Croatian emigration in the West, mostly in the US, but also Western Europe. So we'll talk a bit about the prehistory of Yugoslav immigrants in those areas and the political context. But also then the bulk of the arc will be what I said, these terrorists in the Cold War period, but we'll probably end up quite late in that era, and maybe even touch on the origins of the organized crime in the Yugoslav area that also is connected to this topic. So it's a pretty wide topic. We'll see where we'll end up.
And for those of you who are just here for the freaks, don't worry, they're still around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the mafia chapter is going to be a whole new territory for us. That'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to that.
This only not only involves fascists and nationalists, but also the organized crime aspect, and also the American state and intelligence and so on.
Yeah,
so it's a complexity.
And this is where I think so. The beginning of this arc is going to be a little bit different. And I think that's mostly out of kind of some personal interest. But I think that if you're talking about a context within ex-Yugoslavia, anytime the diaspora is mentioned, and I'm sure Ray can back me up on this, it's kind of completely synonymous with the reactionary collaborationist emigre groups that were active during the Cold War. And there's very good reason for that. But I think what's also interesting when looking at this diaspora, and of course this isn't just true for the Yugoslav immigrants in the U.S., this applies to many different groups too. To me, at least, it's seeing how the trajectory of ending up with those nationalist groups dominating the emigre communities wasn't necessarily an organic or inevitable thing at all. And I mean, to me, it's interesting. I've had a long-standing interest in this of how ideologically diverse and dynamic, especially the late 19th and 20th century was for these communities, and of course wider too. About this time last year, we did the Italian episode, which I think has some strong parallels here. But I mean, there were just so many radical workers organizations, tons of different publications that many of which lasted up into the Cold War. And we're talking socialist, anarchist, communist groups and newspapers, all the way to these kind of broad anti-fascist coalitions that we'll be talking about that were organized to counter some of these nationalist groups that were emerging in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think I want to talk about it because it's a history that's kind of completely neglected and forgotten about. And it's kind of hard to even get a lot of material on that, which is part of why this that interarch period was so long, because sourcing some information on this shit was difficult. But I got my hands on some pretty cool stuff, pamphlets and books that probably don't exist in large numbers today. And
well, I mean, you had to focus on more important things like crystals and underground tunnels and
pyramids,
healing pyramid power and stuff like that.
Novak Djokovic. Yeah, we're crawling out of that dungeon that we've been in for the last couple months, and using the pyramid's magical powers to travel back in time to a different to a different era. I think one of the listeners in our Q&A asked if we're ever going to cover topics of people that we actually like.
Yes.
Or are interested in some. I think kind of the beginning of this arc will be some of that, as far as I'm concerned, at least.
It's a palate cleanser.
Yeah. And as Ray mentioned, we're kind of going to narrow the scope a little bit on North America, even though it's kind of broader than that. I think just for the purposes of this arc not going on for absolutely forever, we're only going to touch on some stuff in Australia, Europe, South America. There's a ton to talk about, but it's fucking not easy to get emigre journals from Argentina and Uruguay and Chile and Paraguay and whatever, especially if you don't have access to archives and certain kinds of institutional access. So yeah, I mean, we'll mostly focus on North America just to keep it simple. But we'll go all over the place.
I mean, who knows? Because these arcs tend to be much longer than we think they will be. So maybe we'll go more detail into some stuff, at least that happened in Europe later on. Maybe we'll see.
Yeah, but so the beginning of the arc will be a little bit different, and then we'll go into. all the weird nationalist, fascist stuff, which is pretty fascinating when I got into it, just from like the perspective of seeing how much influence like emigres exerted, not only on like events in the 90s, but developing ideologies that would kind of become mainstream state ideologies. And on a kind of personal level, it's interesting to me how much that reflects back even onto like modern day diaspora politics, in which there is kind of very little alternative to kind of mainstream narratives that are pushed either by these various states and, you know, religious organizations. So you get like, you know, for people online, you get to see kind of bizarre things. I think Yugoslav diaspora is kind of overrepresented on the internet. And because, you know, people speak English and are like, you know, largely in Western countries, but then you get that phenomenon that's been memed a few times of like Balkan diaspora people when talking about the countries that they live in, and it's, you know, on the far left of the political spectrum meme, and then when they're talking about their countries of origin, it's on the like exact far right. And I think one of my like kind of more ambitious goals with this arc is to kind of look at why that is, especially when you start seeing the influence that North American governments had on like crushing any alternative to that, like pretty severe repression during the Cold War of any kind of alternative to these, you know, nationalist emigre groups, pretty shocking ways. So, you know, I think that like, yeah, I'm kind of ambitious in wanting to just like address that whole issue, and why like people feel the need to basically regurgitate state nationalist narratives in a way that's palatable to the areas and communities that they live in. So just be like, you know, Serbs are actually anti-imperialists, you know, Bosnian subaltern, you know, are we white and this kind of thing.
Right.
Which ultimately kind of, when you boil down a lot of that politics, is not very different than what their like counterparts in like mainstream nationalist parties say there. It's just phrased differently to make it more acceptable, or at least to like rationalize it in your own head. But, you know, that's not the only reality that existed. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we kind of start jumping in a little bit more from y'all?
No. I'm really excited about this. I mean, for a lot of reasons. I'm coming into this, you know, without as much backing as y'all. And I'm going to be learning a lot alongside our listeners here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, although you got some reading material lined up for yourself too, so it won't just be
I do. I got some.
and Ray.
Yeah, you just set me right back to the fucking FOIA requests, like right off the bat. I'm in very comfortable territory here. I can hear the voice from early Arc 3 back in my head. The guy that explains Slavic rebellion like this. You know?
Yes, exactly.
10 million Slavs are going to destroy American democracy. That's pretty much a quote from what I'm reading right now.
yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we already used "Fear of a Slavic Planet" because
that's right. Yeah, that's the name of this arc. I think this arc is called "Fear of a Slavic Planet." Yeah.
Yeah, even the Slavs are in fear of a Slavic planet, of the other Slavic planet. Yeah.
Yes. Bloody Reds. Yeah. We'll have to bring in some Chetniks to spice up the mix. The fighting Chetniks. Also, I mean, we're going to try to make this not as dense and heavy as maybe Arc 2 was. I know a lot of people said that there's like a lot of information crammed into Arc 2. So we'll try to like spread it out a little bit as much as we can. And I've already found some kind of fun film stuff that we can do.
Hey,
oh, nice.
Great.
Couple music things too. So yeah.
There will be movies for this arc for sure.
Oh yeah.
And
absolutely.
music. Yeah.
And music. So fear not. If you're already like, oh God, this is Arc 2 all over again. We're trying our best here. All right. Well, I think to start us off here, I'd like to talk about early migrations to the U.S. from the Balkans. Yeah.
Sorry.
To the U.S. and Canada.
Had a flashback to college there at that opening.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, guys, to start us off.
Power up the whiteboard projector here.
Yep.
Now, Slavs were a barbaric peoples.
What did Mussolini call them? Unlettered hordes or something?
God. Just because he couldn't read Cyrillic.
Or that, like Croatian and Slovenian to him looked like gobbledygook.
Yes.
It's like, why are there not excessive vowels here? What's going on? You can't put that many consonants together. What are you, nuts?
Yep.
So yeah, speaking of the unlettered hordes, early migrations from, let's just call it ex-Yugoslavia, because, I mean, we'll be including Bulgarians a little bit more than we previously have. We pretty much excluded Bulgarians and Slovenes from our previous arc, but Slovenes kind of play a pretty big role here, at least in the early days.
Well, Ray sweated through the Vomero episode, so
Yeah.
that was this. We got a bit in there.
I mean, eventually we'll go into that, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, we'll touch in a little bit on it because, as we'll see, one of the kind of interesting things about this early period is that a lot of it's before the emergence of some of these nation states. So the way that people's identities worked when they came to the Americas is very different than how we'd understand it today. And they kind of use a lot of different terms interchangeably. And there's a lot of kind of intermixing of what are now much more rigid categories than they were in like the 1890s and up until World War I, basically.
Yeah.
So when we talk about like the really early migrations of South Slavs to the Americas, there were some before the Civil War, but very little. Like most of it comes after the Civil War in like the 1880s and 1890s, especially. And most of the early migration, in fact, almost all of it came from territories of Austria-Hungary. People familiar with the Rust Belt in America might have heard the term hunky before. That was kind of a coverall that mostly applied to Slavic peoples, kind of any kind of Slavic peoples, but also to like Hungarians. Not to be mistaken with honky, which is slightly different.
I think we kind
Boris is taking issue with this before.
We did talk about this before, right? Well, I was trying to think about that when I was preparing for this episode. It's like we talked about hunkies, right? Yeah, but
a little bit. Yeah, I think it was in one of the film episodes actually that we kind of tried to explain the difference.
Yeah, well, it's important because to like the average WASP, this was just that. These fucking hunkies over there talking God knows what from Austria-Hungary. So like this really did include like is really a coverall. Like so I'm not just South Slavs and Hungarians, but like Carpatho-Rusins, which were a pretty big immigrant community in the U.S. at this time, which is a nationality that still has no state, right? But mostly comes from Slovakia, the Ukraine, and Serbia, and whatever. So of course, mostly these are like kind of illiterate people from like rural areas of Austria-Hungary. The really early immigrants, and this is true also for the other communities around the world where they're like South Slavs, were Dalmatians, who were mostly sailors. So like the first, because they were just, traveling around the world on fucking boats, working on boats, and would sometimes get off and start living somewhere. So like, I mean, the first like Croats in South America are all Dalmatians, that ended up in like Chile and Argentina, Australia and New Zealand, really like kind of old Dalmatian communities. And some of these will like play an important role in, I think, the next free episode that we do, because there was a lot of organized labor around like sailing unions and stuff like that. And they did all kinds of interesting shit, like smuggling people into the country, smuggling like political refugees from the Kingdom of Yugoslavia into the US and Canada and Cuba and all over the place. It's pretty crazy, but that'll be next episode. So, early communities and even today are centered in what's commonly referred to as the Rust Belt, although California and some places like Montana were also represented. Those were a lot of people working in the logging industry. But by and large, the vast majority of people were living and working in like mines, steel industries, stuff like that. So we're talking basically Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania and Illinois kind of being the really big centers, but also like New York State, including New York City, but especially up north around Buffalo, really large communities out there. And then every once in a while, you see communities popping up in smaller places too. Like there's that totally unrelated, kind of related. One of the leaders of Texan independence was like a Serbian guy from Vojvodina.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, not so much down south, really. Yeah. I should also mention that like because of kind of restrictive immigration laws in the U.S. too, that's also one of the main reasons why you had more people coming from Austria-Hungary and less, for example, from like the Ottoman Empire, which still controlled, large areas of the Balkans, because they wanted Christians. And we'll talk a little bit about like some of the early Muslim communities in the U.S. too, which came from Bosnia, and there were some Albanians and stuff too. But really, that community was much smaller than any of the Christian ones. Mm-hmm. And so as such, like Slovenes kind of made up the bulk of early migration, and they kind of started some of the first fraternal societies. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of these fraternal societies very briefly. Some of them will be super important later on, because there's like a large struggle over who gets to control some of these larger fraternal groups.
I've always said that Slovenes are a gateway Yugoslav. Before harder stuff. So it makes sense. Yeah.
It's like in the 90s when big touring bands would basically only go to Slovenia.
As brave as they were.
The rest of that was like a kind of no-go zone. Kind of very gradually, like, bigger bands started to tour. I think Nirvana maybe went to Croatia because of Chris Novoselic. Might be wrong.
Okay.
I know they played in Slovenia a bunch of times. Anyway, yes, they are a gateway.
I like that Chris Novoselic came up on our first Arc 4 episode here already.
Yeah, who would have thought? Yeah. He's some fucking weird like libertarian or some shit.
Yeah.
He went like the full circle, right? He was in like Green Party, and now he's like a crypto dude or some shit. Fucking idiot. Yeah, I mean, so very briefly, like for people that aren't familiar with like ethnic mutual aid and fraternal organizations in the U.S., they largely started out of just a kind of desperate need for some sort of like safety network in the absence of like a organized social safety network.
Usually around the issue of burials, as I recall.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Around burials, but also like strike aid, unemployment, all that kind of stuff. And so these were largely apolitical. Some of them really varied in their politics from, depending on the time period. And that'll be like pretty important later on. But even in the early days, I think one of the first South Slavic like fraternal organizations in the U.S. was a Slovene Catholic organization.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it did most of, that typical burial and aid to recent immigrants kind of thing. And this is especially important because, again, we're talking about a population that's largely illiterate. Places that they were moving to were really cut off from the rest of the world. They were very much segregated in their own communities. Like I was watching this interview with some like it was filmed in like the early 80s or late 70s by Yugoslav film crew in the US talking to like old members of like immigrant communities there. And they were just like, yeah, I think they were in like Western Pennsylvania, and they're like showing them around, and you see how isolated this place is. Like, it took us 20 years before, like, when the automobile came for us to like leave here. Like, it was like, we lived basically in villages and just like went to like mines to work and stuff like that. But very early on, so I mean, I think the first Catholic organization is founded in Illinois in like 1894. But pretty soon thereafter, the Slovenes organized some of the first secular, like socialist fraternal organizations, and deliberately to take things out of the hands of the church. And so one of the first ones there was the SNPJ, Slovenska Národná podporná jednota. I don't know if my Slovene pronunciation is good, but that was really, it still exists to this day. It was founded in 1904 in Chicago. It moved later to Pennsylvania, to Pittsburgh, right outside of Pittsburgh. But fun fact about the SNPJ rather, is that there's a village in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that is literally called SNPJ.
Whoa.
And it was founded by the organization, from what I can understand, not to be their headquarters, but to evade some sort of prohibition laws that existed in some of these counties. And they wanted to have a club where they could like serve alcohol. It was one of the big things around these fraternal organizations in the early days. And like I said, that'll be important later on, is they established like social clubs. Where, workers could like hang out and drink, and, later on these would become like big centers for reading groups or, whatever, political organizing. But.
So one of the first things that the Slovenian socialists organize around is how can we drink?
Yes.
Pretty much, yeah.
Priorities.
Breaking out of, horrible puritanical WASP society.
Okay, I take back what I said about yodeling and so on.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a fun little fact. But they had some of the first newspapers that were written in any South Slavic language. I'll get into that in a second. But just real quick, some of the other kind of major fraternal organizations that still exist to this day and that had, pretty huge memberships also kind of came about in around the same time period. So the Croatian Fraternal Union was founded in 1894 as well in Allegheny City, which is now part of Pittsburgh. It is still the largest Croatian organization in the U.S. It started off pretty apolitical and had some tumultuous times in the 30s and 40s, 50s, and whatever.
Around
a lot of crazy.
What happened in Croatia?
There's some guys called the Ustashas that also popped up in the same town.
You said there would be no Ustasha here. We had to keep a curse.
You just had to drop it in there. Yeah. But they ran and they still run lodges throughout the U.S. So there's still like Croatian Fraternal Union halls all over the U.S. But that was and is the major like Croatian kind of largely, let's say, a political organization. Serbs also had the Serbian National Federation. It had some previous names prior to that, which was founded in the 1890s in Pittsburgh as well. But again, these are the kind of broad umbrella organizations that fluctuate politically. So if we're talking about like kind of explicit political organizing that occurs outside of the church and is deliberately so, the first newspaper, like I mentioned, out of the Slovenian community is this newspaper called The Proletarian that was founded in 1904 in Chicago. And again, like I said, like ethnic categories weren't super, important at this time.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that like this newspaper, I actually like a couple years ago found somewhere like an archive. I think the Slovenian National Archives put a bunch of them online that you can read. And I tried my best to, read through photocopied, newspapers in Slovenian from 1905 and 1906. But what's interesting about it is that, of course, it didn't remain exclusively in the Slovenian language. So like in some of the later editions, half the newspaper ends up being in Serbo-Croatian too. And we'll see, like, especially with these socialist organizations, we're talking about them now in terms of being Slovene, Croat, or Serbian, but they didn't really see themselves as that. They tended to organize themselves just as South Slavonic. And when they formed federations or groups, it was usually called South Slavonic or Slavic, even sometimes, like societies or labor federations or whatever. So yeah, the Proletarian, like I said, it's an interesting newspaper. It starts to get real interesting around World War I. Unfortunately, I can't even find some of the ones that I had like highlighted stuff on years ago, because God knows where that is between all the hard drives, and I just didn't have the time to like slog through all of their issues. But yeah, it gets pretty intense later on, and the newspaper kind of falls apart and goes into several different directions, like kind of after World War I.
Over the national question.
Kind of over the national question, and then also like some political fracturing, which we'll talk about like now, kind of. Because again, the term socialist in like the 1890s, in the early 1900s, is a pretty broad concept still. And some, factions start to emerge.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because like in the 19th century, socialism meant anarchists were socialists.
Right.
I mean, and like the differences between them, they had a different interpretation of what socialism is. But they were all factions of the socialist movement, or the workers' movement.
Yeah. So then the first Croatian kind of political socialist club was ironically today called the Yugoslav Political Club. That was founded in Pittsburgh in 1903, and then in Chicago in 1907, they founded the first Croatian language socialist newspaper called Workers' Guard. That started publication in Chicago in 1907, led for a long time by this guy Milan Glumac, up until his death, and then carried on. Serbs had a few small socialist organizations pretty early on, and they didn't really come together until a little bit later. But like the kind of most important one to mention in the really early time period is a newspaper out of New York called The Worker, Radnik, in 1906. In 1907, there was a Congress of Serbian Socialists, also in New York City, who then founded a publication as an organ of that like Serbian Socialist Society called Workers' Struggle. But not to be confused with this other workers' struggle, which I've also been interested in for a long time, and that maybe I'll go on a little tangent on now. You guys are okay with that?
Yeah. Don't get me started on the other workers' struggle.
Well, no, the other workers' struggle is pretty interesting. So
also Serbian newspaper or Yugoslav.
Yeah, so people tend to categorize it under Croatian. I'm not exactly sure why, other than that it was printed mostly in Latin script. But from what I can see from their membership, it seems pretty mixed between Serbs and Croats, and even like the odd Slovene here and there. That is, and of course, they're pretty politically hardline about this too. So they're an organ of the South Slavonic branch of the Socialist Labor Party of America. So their newspaper, Workers' Struggle, started in 1907, which is about when that first chapter of South Slavonic workers of the Socialist Labor Party of America started. And this newspaper went all the way up until the 70s. So it existed for quite a long time, although really their peak in all respects was definitely in like the 20s. So they're interesting to me because it's one of the better documented non like Comintern Communist Party socialist organizations in the U.S. In that, again, like I said, they continued to publish up until like 1970. So there's kind of a lot more about them online or anywhere, like books and stuff like that. And you can read,
So they were they basically kind of Marxist revolutionary syndicalists that were aligned with the IWW?
Kind of. So do you guys know anything about De Leonism? Daniel De Leon?
Some basic things, yeah.
I mean, I'm sure like somebody who is like, a big nerd for the U.S. labor movement might like correct me here, but the Socialist Labor
cracking
Party,
their fingers right now.
Yeah, they're like, motherfucker. How dare you? Yeah, I mean, the Socialist Labor Party of America was part of the founding of the IWW. They split off later on for their kind of anti-anarchist stance. But they themselves are generally kind of broadly put under the category of like libertarian Marxism. Which is like interesting. I mean, just like part of the reason that I find this time period pretty like fascinating is all the different socialist groups and like tendencies that existed before the October Revolution, which are like completely forgotten about now. Who the fuck thinks about Daniel De Leon? He took control of the party like later, but he's the ideological, mastermind of the Socialist Labor Party. Just real briefly, Daniel De Leon was from a Jewish guy from Curacao who grew up in Venezuela, I think. So was like also a native Spanish speaker, came to the U.S. And was involved in, this radical labor organizing. I want to read part of what how they separate themselves from the IWW.
Great.
So I'll be talking about some of the South Slavs in the IWW here in a second. The Socialist Labor Party and its affiliate, the Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance, were instrumental in establishing the original industrial workers of the world in 1905. At first, the IWW was a sound socialist organization. It was based on class struggle, and it grasped the need for the workers to organize on the political as well as on the economic field. Its acceptance of political action was crucial. By accepting that principle, the original IWW stated, in effect, that it would strive for a peaceful transition to socialism, I'm not sure how much of that is true, and would hold its economic power in reserve to enforce the revolutionary ballot. From the beginning, however, the IWW was harassed from within by an element that rejected political action and espoused the theories and practices of anarchism. The ST and LA-SLP element fought off the anarchists for 3 years until the 1908 convention, where the anarchists, using strong-arm methods, captured the IWW by physical force and promptly jettisoned the political clause from the IW's constitution. By rejecting political action, the IWW's only alternative automatically became that of physical force and violence, i.e. direct action, sabotage, and propaganda of the deeds. These methods have been identified with anarcho-syndicalism in the IWW ever since.
Oh, they're those guys.
Now, I'm going to mention this just because I am, like I said, going to talk about some of the South Slavs in the IWW, but also later on, like in the 20s and 30s, anytime somebody like in the South Slavic sections of the Communist Party of the USA would do something remotely out of step with the party line, they would be accused of being anarcho-syndicalists and under the influence of the IWW. So the Socialist Labor Party South Slavic faction had a pretty big presence. Like I said, mostly they were based out of Cleveland, but they were in the early days. So like post 1908, they were kind of all over the U.S. They also had chapters in like emigre communities in Argentina and Uruguay, and maybe somewhere else too. But it's interesting to keep them in mind for stuff later on because they hold on to an extremely like dogmatic anti-Leninism. And so they get into conflict a lot with other immigrant, like South Slavic immigrant communities later on when people start joining the Communist Party. They also criticized the partisans when there was a lot of money being sent to the partisans and volunteers and the like. And then later are hardcore anti-Titoists. And but by that time, if we're talking about like the 50s and 60s, their numbers are very small. But apparently, they did have some contacts in Yugoslavia who were also holding the De Leonis line
before the Second World War or after?
Before and after.
Oh, interesting.
Like after they get in touch with some of the Yugoslav communists in the U.S. who are tightly connected to Tito and are officially allowed to send their newspapers to Yugoslavia, to some of their followers, although they say in some of their own writings that they doubt that it ever made it to them, that like their letters and the like were being intercepted, and that like people stopped writing back to them. And they kind of attribute that to, a crackdown on the non-Leninist socialists. So like, it's an interesting newspaper to read. Like in World War II, when Mussolini is killed, they're like, one capitalist ruler to be replaced by another capitalist ruler and stuff like that. So they hold this line pretty strongly. I think they're also among those that kind of ideologically rejected popular frontism and anti-fascism kind of as a phenomenon in general. And like I said, that'll be kind of important in the next free episode too, because that was a major development in these communities, like in the 30s especially. And so they hold the line. And then it's funny, I mean, it's kind of sad to read their like monthly or their yearly reports back to like HQ, because like basically after the 20s they steadily decline in numbers, but they have that fantastic jargon where they're like, complaining that other communists won't let them into their discussion groups, and that's because they fear, the kind of facts and logic of Daniel De Leon and like true De Leonist Marxist thought and stuff like that. Which again is just funny to like me out of somebody that's interested in like that time period, because who the fuck still talks about De Leonism? I mean, again, somebody's probably like, well, motherfucker, Socialist Labor Party of America does still exist. They do still have Congresses and
facts
whatever.
Don't care about your feelings.
But they definitely have that vibe to them, which I know was like more common way to like talk back in the day. Like, especially like when people would like in some of the kind of anti-clerical movements and stuff like that. They're like, well, if only we could just go and, debate priests on, show them facts and logic, that kind of stuff. But De Leonis definitely have that vibe. Worker Struggle definitely has that vibe. Nonetheless, it's super interesting to read. I might try to talk more about them at some point if we have time for another episode, because like I said, I've read a lot about these motherfuckers.
Cool.
Mostly actually just reading their newspapers. But since we mentioned the IWW, we should mention some of the kind of big names from the South Slavic lands in the IWW. And by that, and we'll talk some more about anarchists too, in general. One of the more important guys to the IWW in general and to like North American anarchism for some time, at least in some languages, was this guy Andrei Klemencic, also known as Al Klemencic, or Andrew Al Klemencic. Again, you'll see throughout this arc that people have anglicized names a lot. Makes it very difficult to look stuff up about them. Spellings get all kind of kooky, and Stepan becomes Steven sometimes, but sometimes something, whatever. But Al Klemencic was a ethnic Slovene from Trieste, which is in Italy today. Don't tell a lot of Slovenes that it's still a sensitive subject. Or crowd. I mean, whatever. But he's an interesting guy because he's Slovene from Trieste, which I think at the time might have been, was it controlled by Austria-Hungary? Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, before the First World War. Yeah.
Yeah. He is renowned through these North American anarchist circles for being like very multilingual. So he speaks fluently like Italian, Slovenian, German, and is also one of the few to break out into the English like speaking anarchist press and the like. I think he was a tailor by trade. He organized in the Journeyman's Tailor Union, and also spoke French because he wrote in French anarchist publications as well. He was a member like of the founding. He was at the founding Congress of the IWW and represented kind of the most like the anarchist wing of the IWW, right? He famously organized part of Emma Goldman's 1898 tour through the Bay Area. So he had like connections with, the old school big names of the time. And lived in Paterson, New Jersey for a while, along with this other guy, Francesco Vidmar. Get into him in just a second. It is also just weird thing about Klemencic. He went to Hawaii when it was, still mostly independent, to organize workers out there. Interesting fact about him.
That just says he's a man who's got it figured out. I'm going to go do radical organizing. Oh, where? Yeah, Hawaii. That's the way to do it.
So I just mentioned Francesco Vidmar, Franz Vidmar. Again, he is another Slovene from Trieste. Not sure if he actually knew Al Klemencic before they ended up in Paterson, New Jersey together, but they definitely like collaborated a lot when he was there.
Paterson, of course, is the anarchist capital of America at the time.
Yeah, who wasn't there? I mean, it was a big center for Italian anarchism. Of course, the Gallianists were there, and Malatesta was there.
Yes.
And, all of those guys. And Vidmar seemed to primarily run in Italian circles. So when he comes to the U.S., I believe he came to the U.S. Because he got arrested in Rijeka, aka Fiume, for some political activities and was deported and got on some Hungarian steamship and ends up in the U.S. In like 1899 and lives in Paterson, New Jersey. So, I mean, he had like a reputation, I guess, before in like Italian anarchist circles in the old country and kind of picked up pretty immediately when he got to the U.S. So he was in an editor of La Questione Sociale, where I think he followed Malatesta as the editor of that journal. Around then. So, I mean, again, he's kind of like in with these kind of big names of Italian American anarchism. He gets into some trouble in New Jersey and ends up going to Florida, where apparently he connects with Spanish-speaking Caribbean anarchists, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and also Mexicans. There's some interesting stuff about him later on that I'm not quite clear on, that he had some sort of connection to Flores Magón in Mexico and in Southern California, rather, and that he was in California too, maybe even went to Mexico during the Mexican Revolution.
Is this the origin of the Yugoslav mariachi thing?
Oh, shit.
I think that came later. I think that was a diplomatic project, but it is fantastic.
No, actually, I'm going with Ray here. I'm just going to go and say that is true. You can quote me on that, because he does end up going back to the old country, and
Okay.
Yeah, let's just say that's true.
He would have had to have brought Trubachi music then to Mexico in that same moment to make that work out, I think.
That's not necessarily true. Maybe he just got super into like Mexican music in general, and then singing some songs that turned into,
I see a documentary here about the Yugoslav mariachi program.
Yes. That it definitely preceded the 1940s and 50s. And that in fact was founded by Francesco Vidmar.
Who picked up a trumpet and a guitarron and just changed the world.
All right, I'm liking this. So again, he was part of a bunch of different groups as well. Kind of a few other big name ones, but he was behind the newspaper and group L'Era Nuova, which was also, I guess, in New Jersey, New York, but published a lot of some of the big names like Berkman. So he was also connected to those guys too. If we're doing the big people in history here. Connecting them to the important guys. So these aren't just some schlubs doing. These are important South Slav contributors to American anarchism.
That's right.
What's happened to be an Italian. I remember that before the First World War, there were anarchist newspapers being published in Belgrade, and they had an action of gathering money donations for the revolution in Mexico. So they obviously had some connection. It's possible it went through him.
Yeah, it would be interesting to read more about that, because from what I understand, there were some in the Italian anarchist community that were kind of critical of the Mexican Revolution. And I'm kind of interested where somebody like Vidmar stood on some of that stuff. And again, when you're talking about these guys. And we'll see in a second here, especially about anarchist literature in Serbo-Croatian. There's just very, very little information that's easily accessible. Other than there's definitely stuff written about Vidmar and stuff like that in English. A lot more in Italian, which I don't read, unfortunately. So that's kind of a whole other world to go into, because kind of next honorable mention here is something that you, I think, were interested in, Ray, a while ago, which was the apparently Serbian language anarchist newspaper Volja.
Yeah.
In San Francisco or in California, I think.
Yeah, they changed, I think, the location. They were in San Francisco and New York at some point, I think, as well.
Yeah, again, I can find very little information on it. The only time I really see it mentioned is in Kenyon Zimmer's book, Immigrants Against the State, where he mentions them briefly. I'm actually just going to read the quote from his book because it sums it up pretty well. In addition, in 1909, the local Yugoslav League of Independent Socialists published the Serbian language anarcho-syndicalist paper Volja, Will, and Oakland police described that city's anarchist movement as consisting chiefly of Servians and Italians. But kind of beyond that, I really don't know much about who those guys would be. And it's hard to look up even the Yugoslav League of Independent Socialists, because they tended at this time not to use the term Yugoslav, but South Slavonic or Slavonic or whatever. So I don't know. I've looked before, but really haven't seen much beyond what Kenyon has kind of written about them. I'd like to get him on the show. Maybe pick his brain a little bit.
No, I'm thinking not just what I mentioned about those anarchist newspapers in Belgrade collecting money for the Mexican Revolution, because they were closely aligned with Volja. So Volja was distributed by them in Serbia at the time, and they had people from Volja from America published text in those anarchist newspapers published in Serbia and vice versa. So probably through them and through those Slovenian guys from Trieste, because here it's mentioned that there are also Italians in Volja. Maybe that was the whole connection with Mexico, probably.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. It's hard to connect the dots, though, in the absence of very much written material on that at all. I don't know. Do you know of anybody who's done a kind of in-depth study of that?
No. I think no one did.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. So, that's kind of what we can really say, at least on when it comes to South Slavic anarchism in North America. is that somebody should write more on it. And if you know more about it, let us know. Well, then let's get into a little bit of World War I, and then we can kind of end at the first Red Scare. So, I know I haven't done the U.S. labor movement from like the 1880s to, the first Red Scare much justice. It's an incredibly restive time period in the U.S. Of course, the world celebrates May Day as a result of, the Haymarket Massacre and, some of the biggest, strikes in U.S. history were going on at this time, Homestead. And very quickly we get to the first major state repression, or at least the biggest one up until kind of, the 50s, in the form of the first Red Scare. I'm saying major. There were like anti-socialist legislations in the 1890s as well, which made it difficult for some groups to exist. And people were constantly getting like arrested and deported and bounced back and forth. I mean, that's one of the things that, again, in this time period is super interesting, that at least I always tended to think of this time period as immigrants went to a certain place and they, that was it. They stayed there. Traveling was not as easy as it is today. It's absolutely not true, because you could just forge documents or stow away on ships. And so somebody like Malatesta is like a good example of that, right? I mean, he bounces around like fucking 3 continents throughout his life. There's people that end up all over the fucking place. I mean, Klemenčić goes to Hawaii, people are moving around a lot. And so people like Vidmar get deported, and they're in Italy for a while, come back, blah, 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 blah. But, World War I is kind of a major turning point, especially for the South Slavic workers' organizations, because it's where you start to see some of the first fractures kind of along the politics around national liberation and the national question. So real quick, I want to just mention something that I also saw in Kenyon Zimmer's book about World War I, which is that some Italian anarchists in America responded to Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Franz Ferdinand as being primarily motivated by nationalism, and that they couldn't really applaud that aspect of it, but that regicide, always good. Nothing warms, I think, an Italian anarchist's heart at this point more than, offing a fucking royal somewhere. So in that sense, whatever, they were cool with it. But again, Vidmar, for example, said that the principle of nationality was flawed, that, blah, blah, blah. And we know that, within the socialist movements in general and anarchist movements, there was a split here, right? Kropotkin famously supported the war effort, not unlike some of the splits you see today around kind of the same questions of national liberation and the like. These were particularly pronounced in these South Slavic groups and in Russian groups as well. So like I mentioned before, I remember reading articles in the Slovenian language Proletarian about this issue, debates going back and forth on, what the, potential is for, national liberation there, for socialism. And, the debates are about more or less what you'd understand, what you'd expect. I think some of the fracturing in the Socialist Labor Party also happened because of this as well, because we know also that at the time period, one of the major activities that the left and anarchists were getting in trouble for in the U.S. was counter recruitment and anti-militarist positions, right? And rejecting the draft and participation in the war and stuff like that. On the other side, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk more specifically about some of the Serbian organizations and even Croatian ones that were organizing around more of a national basis or with the church, were very active in the war effort, in, agitating for the cause of the war, including sending hundreds of volunteers to fight in World War One. Primarily Serbs, but there were some Croats involved in that as well. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about organizations like Serbian National Defense in Canada also as well.
That's Serbian National Defense will be, I think, a very important group for this arc.
Absolutely.
Exists still, by the way. And it was founded in America in 1914, and which is also significant. So with the First World War, really, I think came more like the dominance, or at least stronger influence of nationalist groups.
Yeah.
That some of which will later even be, you could call them fascist and connected to all kinds of things, like Serbian National Defense.
Right. And of course, America comes in on the side of Serbia, right? On the side of the Allies, right? In World War One, and so the Serbian national cause was actually very popular in Washington. Again, this is stuff we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about the specific Serbian groups, but it did have a major effect on these workers' organizations because it's kind of the first time since the founding of these organizations that they really had to kind of, draw a line in the sand and decide whether, they are organizing as proletarians or whether they're organizing on a national basis, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the reverberations of that will continue on, throughout this arc, right? Because, Serbia was an independent state. It had relations with the U.S. at the time. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or Kingdom of Yugoslavia later, was a much more important state, which did lobby and make a big effort in organizing in the diaspora. They definitely saw the value of that, probably more so than what the Kingdom of Serbia could really muster at the time. So, for the purposes of this episode, we'll just keep that in mind for later. It's hard to concretely say without going really much more in depth, what number of people left certain working men's organizations to, be more affiliated with the church and stuff like that. But again, that's even complicated because, as we'll see later on, within the church, there were there are many different opinions on the national question in ways that I didn't really know about or expect earlier. Mm-hmm. And that's true in the Orthodox Church and in the Catholic Church.
Well, there were communists in the church.
There were, and we'll save that for the next free episode because that was very interesting to me. I really didn't know much about that fucking at all.
Yeah. Well, also, in Yugoslavia, there was a large contingent of priests who were in partisans.
Right. Speaking of religion, and since I'm bad at reading the notes that I already have written in any kind of chronological order, I did forget to mention the first Muslim benevolent society that was primarily organized by Bosnian Americans, although there are some indications that there were others involved in it as well, even Turks and Albanians. But again, this is complicated because they tended to always call people Turks. Right. Whether it was in the Balkans, they refer to them as Turks, but definitely American immigration authorities did not exactly know what they were dealing with a lot.
Well, so it's all Turks and Hunkies then.
Yeah. Oh, well, in this case, these were probably Turkish citizens who were Muslims, so they kind of didn't know how to differentiate between them.
Or Austro-Hungarian subjects,
okay.
Right? Because we're talking about post-annexation of Bosnia.
Well, I think, Bosnia was controlled by Austro-Hungary, but officially it was a part of Turkey. So I think they were until the annexation, I guess.
I think you're overthinking it. I think they just based what they said on their hats. Whatever hat you had walking on, you were a Turk or a Hunk.
Turk. Yes. Actually, in the next premium episode, we'll talk about some of these jokes a little bit that existed around this. But yeah, for honorable mention, there was a Muslim Religious Benevolent Society founded in 1906 in Chicago that had a couple chapters, again, in areas that tended to have large already, with other South Slavic immigrants. So Gary, Indiana which surprisingly is going to be a very important place in this arc.
Huh. Who knew?
Butte, Montana. I had to look up where the fuck this one place was. One of the first Muslim cemeteries in America is in like this village outside of Ligonier, Pennsylvania, called like Winburn or something. I can find no indication that there's anything left of this cemetery. But like I said, because of kind of American immigration laws, the number of Muslims that came to the U.S. was still pretty small at this time. That population would increase a lot more after World War II. But, in this time period, pretty small. There are some interesting facts about it being one of the first organized Muslim burial societies in America. But beyond that, I don't really know that much, to be honest, because there's not all that much, it's very small. And it mostly, again, centered around these kind of mining areas in which, people had to bury someone when they died, according to the proper rites. I know that, there were several Balkan Muslims who died in the Titanic, for example. That's an interesting fact.
Trying to figure out how to make that like a nationalist talking point.
Well, a lot of South Slavs died in the Titanic.
There you go. So Titanic is basically Slavic land now.
There was that famous Yugoslav stamp that commemorated the sinking of the Titanic, which is the Titanic sinking and it's Yugoslavia under it. It's kind of funny, sad. So yeah, let's close this episode out with again the first Red Scare, because if World War I is where you see some of the diaspora start to fracture a little bit more along the national question, this is a little bit more intensified by the first Red Scare, which led to some of these leaders of these socialist organizations and workers groups in the U.S. To be deported, back to the old country. Some of them would make it back. Eventually, most did not. So yeah, I mean, deportations and this kind of government crackdown we'll talk a lot more about later. But it is very important to breaking the momentum of groups when you face that kind of state repression. And I mean, we could do a whole arc just on the first Red Scare, because that's a very interesting time period, right? Because that's I think there were a lot more people deported than most people know about or think about. You know what I mean? Kind of more brutal in a lot of ways than the second Red Scare. They were a little bit more hands-on back in the day.
Right.
Yeah. Certainly normal to torture people and kind of stuff.
Hang them in barns and
yeah. All right, guys. So how do you feel about this?
Well, yeah. So I guess it's mostly assholes from now on.
No, we got some.
No. So the next maybe 2-3 episodes, we'll be talking about some more of the workers' organizations and then anti-fascists that emerge in the 20s and 30s and then World War II. Because there was a lot happening with Yugoslav workers in America during World War II.
Okay.
And a lot of conflict. And again, not something that is really easy to find information about. I have these pamphlets, which I'm very excited about sharing, that talk about this time period. Some of them were published during World War II. I really don't know how many of them are left. I had to dig pretty deep to find some of that stuff. So, we'll talk about the Spanish Civil War. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff in the next 2 episodes.
Okay.
And then I think we're diving pretty head on into assholedom. So enjoy it while you can. I guess if you're into that kind of thing, if you're like, oh, fucking goddamn anti-fascists, who knew that Chetniks and Ustashas were getting beat up in the U.S. This might not be the right show for you in that case.
Yeah, but people who are looking forward to listening about fascist terrorists, do not fear, there will be a lot of them.
Yes.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, we are bound by an ancient curse to occasionally report on what's going on with our favorite Nazi Satanists, and the standards will stick around.
Yeah, worry not.
Worry not. Yes.
We'll break up. We'll break it up every once in a while with some
real
updates.
Stupid garbage.
Some real stupid garbage.
Just like y'all love.
Maybe another satanic hoedown. Who knows?
Oh, I don't know about that.
We'll have they say satanic tamburitzan ensemble.
There we go. There we go. Yes. All right. Well, welcome to Arc 4, boys.
Okay.
Cheers. See you soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.